nice to see the rotation of faces. It's a little bit late because of summer, I think, maybe. But there's always a group of the regulars and a group of new faces that don't come around all the time. So it's really gratifying to see how this thing has a life of its own. I don't feel like any one of us necessarily has to be here or anything. So it's not easy to get to that point in the meetup. So thank you all for coming. And reminding everybody to consider joining if you haven't yet. If you remember, and you can help keep this thing going. It takes a little bit of money to run the space here. Not a lot, but it is a budget that we need to cover, and that takes money. So go to the webpage, consider buying a membership, or go to the Patreon page. That thing's finally starting to get a few legs on it.
$16.
$16 a show, right? Well, it was 2 for how long, man?
Right.
2, so it's like maybe we go 2 for 8, 16.
There you go. Hey.
Before you know it. Right, so we have a Patreon page too. And we're getting ready for the conference in October. If anybody needs to get out there activism, has time on their hands and wants to help, we always need volunteers for all of that stuff. Flyers around town, getting the word out, helping with just in the end shows and stuff. So see any of us, Sean, myself, Brian's here tonight, everybody's here. If you want to get more involved, we meet on Sundays after the podcast at 3 o'clock, where we sort of go over our planning. Not sort of, we technically go over all of our planning and what's coming up, real meetings. So, more than just someone who comes to the meetups and want to be more involved, then come to the Sunday meetings too. And check us out on Meetup. All the stuff that's going on. What else is up?
Top 15.
Yeah, the podcast made it to top 14.
14.
Let's not cheat ourselves.
All right.
We're top 14 on iTunes. Very exciting.
Batman and Jesus.
Like I said, Batman and Jesus. I'm wearing an authorized shirt. Don't tell Joseph K. that I wore it. I'm keeping it. It's cool. It's feedback. And, yeah. Spread the word about the movie. Help tweet it. If you're not on Twitter, get a Twitter. And Smith is such MKE. So that's all I got for you. Our buddy Godless is here from Alabama way. Can you hear me, Godless, from here?
Yeah, barely, but I mean, I can hear you.
He's actually a member. He's on the thread, and he's one of our people. He's been in it for probably longer than we have. The engineer part came through, as Sean said. We can interact without muting this time because he is an engineer besides being Godless. Welcome to the program, Godless. Take it away. Thanks for joining us, man.
No, I have to say thank you guys. I really do appreciate it. I never really expected to be giving this kind of talk at all, so it's really great for me personally. And but anyways, to get on to it, I am the Godless Engineer. I run a Facebook page that just surpassed 100,000 people on it. And I also run a YouTube channel. And today we're going to be talking about, why Jesus is a myth, the origins of a mythical Christ, basically. When I first started collecting my notes for this particular talk, I bit off more than I could chew, basically, because when I started writing it, I found that I was getting a lot of information on this one particular topic, and there's a lot more to the whole Jesus myth than this one single presentation. So what I did was I refocused my presentation to be just to just focus on the birth of Christ using both Old Testament prophecies and pre-existing pagan traditions. And what this presentation hopes to do is to relate the Old Testament to what we see in the New Testament concerning Jesus Christ, and then also relate those to pre-existing pagan traditions as a way to show how the Jesus myth could have been completely constructed, just using Old Testament and the pagan beliefs that were around at the time. Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, I see, buddy. All right, so to start off here, just kind of like a brief overview, the early first century Christians, they really looked to the Old Testament for a lot of prophecies as far as it concerns with Jesus Christ. And from the virgin birth narrative all the way to the miracles that he performed within the New Testament themselves. The first century Christians interpreted these prophecies as a blueprint for this Messiah person, and ended up creating these confusing paradoxes, confusing storylines for the actual Christ myth.
Oh, one sec, John. John, can you hear me?
Daniel predicted
John?
the Messiah will come, and it will be 70 weeks of years. If you're not familiar, I am getting that echo.
Yeah, do you hear it? All right, I'm going to mute you.
Okay. All right. So Daniel 9:24 through 27 predicts when the Messiah will come, and that's 70 weeks of years. And the gospel writers ended up figuring out that he not only, Matthew at least, was not only interpreting this as the amount of time between this, between the Babylonian exile to Jesus coming, that it wasn't only the time, but the amount of generations. 14 was a significant number to Matthew, and so when he saw this number, he like immediately clicked in his head, and he started doing a bunch of funky math in order to get the lineage of Jesus to connect with David. Matthew basically miscounted his generations. He was off by about 4 or so generations when he was counting. And what this ended up resulting in is a different lineage from Luke. As we all know, both Matthew and Luke have different lineages for Jesus Christ. But there's a lot of questions that surround, for one thing, why did they produce different lineages? And then number two, why is it that these lineages connect Jesus to David, but yet he's supposed to be this divine this divine Son of God. He ends up having two fathers, basically. Well, the Jewish community, or the community in general, of Jewish Christians and Jews, were split on needing a Davidic Jesus in the early first century. Jewish Christians needed a Davidic line in order to connect it back to David because that's what was prophesied in the Old Testament. But then Mark actually has Jesus deliberately say that he is not of David. Like I believe the exact line in the Bible is that why does David call him Lord and all this other Lord stuff? But basically Jesus was saying that I can't be the son of God when I'm the son of David, or son of David and son of God. Anyways, that links back to Psalm 10. Matthew and Luke provided the pagans that were entering into Christianity with their tradition of a divine fatherhood. You see, the thing with the pagans is that they were very used to gods coming down, impregnating mortal women, and having these sort of demigod babies. And this was kind of like a normal thing for religion with them. And the challenge for early first century Christians was for them to work in a way for the pagans to easily transition to Christianity. If they could do that, then they could really make Christianity popular and easy to convert to. Now, the virgin birth, of course, is what Jesus is known for. Justin Martyr actually claimed that the virgin birth was predicted by the prophets. It's based on Isaiah 7:14, but it was taken out of context. In this particular passage, they're talking about a infant or a baby that is going to be born of a young woman. That's the first mistranslation of it. But the actual context of the prophecy concerns or the line, not the prophecy, was the Syro-Israelite crisis. Basically, in Isaiah, he was describing when these invaders were going to be out of the land. And he was describing some kind of future state of events, not prophesizing like the actual birth of the Messiah. But the pagan beliefs are the source for the virgin birth. A lot of pagans at the time, would have virgins giving birth to their gods. Why is Jesus a myth? The virgin birth, we have different virgin birth stories. Matthew and Luke have them, but Luke has very telling signs of confusion. Matthew's account resembles that of a lot of other ancient persons. The husband was informed in a dream that his wife was going to be impregnated, and then abstains from sex with the wife. This is similar to Plato. Plato has an origin story that says a god came down, impregnated his mom, told his dad, hey, I knocked your girl up, and then, he abstains from sex, and, Plato was born of a virgin, right? So Luke has an angel informing Mary, but it has this very curious error in it. In the entire passage, when Luke has the angel explaining to Mary that she's going to be having a child, and the child is going to be named Jesus or whatever, at the very end of it, what Mary says is very telling, because she says, how am I going to be pregnant if I know not a man? At the time, she was betrothed to Joseph. So, it should have been, common knowledge that, of course, I'm going to get pregnant after I get married. But for some reason, she's very curious about whether or not, or why she's going to be pregnant. And so this whole part was jammed in there in order to emphasize the divine fatherhood of Jesus, in order to emphasize that God impregnated Mary in order to give them Jesus, and therefore Jesus is, God on earth. And this was a later insertion into that particular part of the Bible. Now, as far as the birthplace goes, Bethlehem is where he's supposed to be born, but Micah 5:2 is actually referenced as the prophecy in which tells you that Jesus Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem. Christians reinterpreted this passage to predict the birthplace of Jesus, but like with a lot of interpretations that they did back then, they took it out of context. They didn't, if they could make a prophecy seem like it's about Jesus, then it was definitely about Jesus. John 7:27 catalogs that the Jews didn't know where to expect the Messiah to come from. So, we know that it's the Christians that misinterpreted this and worked it into the Bible, because the Jews at the time didn't know where the Messiah was going to come out of. And that was part of their doctrine. This causes a problem because Jesus actually grew up in Nazareth, which is a totally different nationality from David. So what we have is Matthew and Luke actually, coming to you with these different stories for, Jesus's birth. Matthew actually has them living in Bethlehem and giving birth in Bethlehem, and then leaving out to go to Egypt, and then coming back to Nazareth. While Luke actually has them living in Nazareth, and then traveling to Bethlehem at the very end of the pregnancy, and then traveling out to Egypt into seclusion. And yeah, that's what I just mentioned is the first bullet there. In the Septuagint, which was the Old Testament or the Torah back then, if a verse could be interpreted as a prophecy for Jesus, then they definitely made it about Jesus. which caused like the uneasy mixture that we saw with Matthew and Luke. Throughout all of Matthew and Luke, we have these uneasy mixtures of the stories that give different accounts. The Magi were unnecessarily went to Jerusalem. If you don't recall, Matthew chronicling the Magi coming and giving Jesus the various presents. They go to Jerusalem first, and then they go out to Bethlehem. And this was really unnecessary because apparently there was supposed to be a star in the sky to point them directly where it was. So if they had the GPS location of where Jesus was born, why did they have to go and stir up King Herod, let him know that the king of the Jews was born, and enrage him? The rising star is a complete legend. It originated in the Jewish apocryphal book of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. The Magi were part of Greco-Roman traditions. You see this in various different historical accounts of emperors, rulers. Like Pliny here tells us that Tiridates, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, brought the Magi with him to pay homage to Nero. Dio Cassius describes the manner in which the Magi greet Caesar by kneeling and folding their arms. Suetonius records an astrologer or Magi calling out that a ruler was of the world was born. Suetonius records that a completely different astrologer or Magi bowing to Augustus upon entering his home. And these are all things that were done when the Magi approached Jesus in his manger. So all of those traditions, the Magi coming and everything, I mean that was already pre-existing in the culture at the time. Matthew 2:16 through 18 cites a source in Jeremiah as predicting this event, and of course, if it can be predicted as prophesizing Jesus, then it will be. There's basically an outline of how kings of Israel are received by those outside of the faith. Outlined in the Moses tale of Pharaoh in Egypt, the king wants to kill the infant leader. In this case, there's Nimrod, Herod, and then the infant leader, Abraham, Jesus. Parents flee with the infant till the evil king dies. This mirrors the Old Testament, and this mirroring effect is common in the New Testament. When it concerns the Old Testament, you especially see this with the miracles that Jesus supposedly performs. You see them taking the events of what happened with the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and pretty much just reversing them and making Jesus do them. They use the miracles that Elijah and Elisha did in order to craft the miracles that Jesus did. Because if they were prophets of God and Jesus is the prophet of God, then he must have done these things. Of course, Moses, getting back to the topic at hand here, Moses, he flees out of Egypt to Midian, while Jesus, he flees to Egypt through Midian. So you can see how this mirroring effect occurs here in his birth story. Hosea 1:11 predicts that Joseph will be called out of Egypt, and it's actually a misinterpreted line in Hosea, like all of these other prophecies, because Christians apparently like to do that back in the first century. Both Moses and Joseph exhibit similar stories. Moses being called to Egypt by the Lord, Joseph being called out of Egypt by the Lord. Matthew has Jesus born in Bethlehem and then moved to Nazareth, and Luke has him living in Nazareth and moving to Bethlehem, like we had mentioned previously. This results in the effect, though, of this is that this results in Luke saying that Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod, but then traveling there for the census. That provides you with about a good 10-year gap of when these things were supposedly happening. So, I mean, unless Mary had a really long pregnancy, I don't think that his account really holds up. The birthing of a Savior. Isaiah 1:3 in the Septuagint predicts that the Messiah will, one, not be known in Israel and will be born in front of livestock. They interpret this because, apparently there was a king that was born, the king of Israel that was born, and the first to see him were oxen and ass, I believe is what it was. Jesus being swallowed at birth is connected to Solomon, and that's sourced in the apocryphal book of Wisdom. 2 Samuel and 2 Kings records the Lord telling David that he took him from the stables of the sheep. So with him coming to Bethlehem, not having a room at the inn, not having to be born in a manger in basically a shed for the livestock. I mean, all of these things were already happening, or quote unquote foretold, in the Septuagint. So they already existed there, and because they existed there, they must have happened when Jesus was born. The December 25th birthday was given to Jesus to coincide with existing religious traditions. Mainly Mithras. Mithras was perceived to be born on December 25th, which also coincides with the solstice, the winter solstice. And this is a time when, of course, the sun, it's the shortest day of the year, and this was celebrated, back in ancient past. They saw this as a time of rebirth. And that's what, with Mithras being the primary god of the region, that's why he was given the December 25th birthday. The pre-Christian Egyptians celebrated virgin births on the solstice, and the infant was actually the sun. And the Old New Testament takes on a number of sun worship attributes. We see Samson, who's actually just a reimagining of the Shamash of Babylon. In Samson's story, he burns fields. He has 7 locks of hair, and those are meant to represent the rays of the sun. When he loses his hair, of course he loses his strength, and he's blinded. All of those things are indicative of some kind of sun worship. Elijah, he calls fire from the sky, and he raises up to the sky on a burning chariot, just like Apollo. That's pre-existing Christian, or not Christian, but pagan beliefs that were worked into the story in order to make it, a bit more believable for Christians. Enoch, God's walking companion around the earth, and suspiciously has a lifespan of 365 years. Now, early Christians didn't exactly celebrate the exact date Christ was born in the early 1st century. They knew that he was born of a virgin. They knew, circumstances surrounding his birth and whatnot, or at least they thought they were told. But what they what they did celebrate was the Epiphany, and this is something that's even taught today with Christians. The Epiphany was celebrated on January 6th, and what the Epiphany was the proposed, actual birth of the Messiah, and that's when he got baptized in the Jordan River. Ironically, it was actually the birthday of another old god of theirs in pagan worship, Aeon, Lord of Infinite Time. And by a different calendar, January 6th was actually the solstice. So these births and whatnot are really meant to coincide with these solstices. That's what ties them with the sun and sun worship. The Epiphany is still a theological stance today. A lot of people don't. A lot of people say that the Lord entered Jesus when he was pulled out of the Jordan River. A lot of people say that he was, divine from birth. But I have heard people argue that he was not considered the Son of God until he was pulled out of the Jordan River in his baptism. the birth of Jesus actually didn't take any kind of importance until about 200 AD. That's when Hippolytus first referenced the nativity occurring on December 25th. Then it wasn't until the late or the early 300s, when the Council of Nicaea was convened, that it became theologically important. Because at the Council of Nicaea, what actually happened was that I can't remember the ruler, Constantine. When Constantine convened it, the whole purpose of the Council of Nicaea was to determine whether or not the Gospels and all the Christian teachings were God-breathed, and if Jesus was indeed the Son of God, or if it was not God-breathed and just written down by his most esteemed prophets or esteemed people in the religion, and effectively not making Jesus like the direct Son of God. And of course, Constantine, he had a preference, and he let his preference, of course, affect the outcome of the council. And what ended up happening was the Bible is God-breathed, as we all know it today, and Jesus is the Son of God, as we all know it today. And so that wasn't until the 300s. So early first century Christians weren't really concerned with Jesus's birth. When all of this went down, when Mark was written, when any of the Gospels were written. That's why we have, like, with the account of Mary seeing the angel, being told that she's going to be giving birth to Jesus. That's why there's that extra bit that's stuck in there. They went back, they edited things in the Bible in order to make it, in order to emphasize things like the divine fatherhood of Jesus. And sorry, but that's all I've got. So here, time for questions or complaints about what I'm saying.
Where can you find information on Plato's virgin birth? Is that pretty easy to find?
Yeah. Let's see. The two sources that I pulled from are The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man and Gospel Fictions. Gospel Fictions really works hard to connect the New Testament to the Old Testament, so all the references where I was connecting old to new came from Gospel Fictions, the information provided in there. Then, of course, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man provided more historical context of the virgin birth, like when these certain things became, or when we have that most earliest accounts of certain things happening, like people focusing on the virgin birth and whatnot. So I would highly suggest both of these books to read. I'm not exactly sure where to find it on the net about Plato. I know that The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man does have a pretty good reference in the back, so I can find that out and provide it later.
So Brian asked, what is the Epiphany? Even though you explained it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the Epiphany is basically when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist and then pulled out, and then Christians believe that God then entered into Jesus, kind of like a holy possession, and pretty much strutted around in a Jesus suit on earth. So that's what they said, that's what they believed at the time, and then later on they started celebrating Jesus as being divinely born from the beginning. So that was a later development in the faith.
Well, I thought it was interesting when you said that initially, the fact that baptism is a pagan practice. So the fact that he didn't become Jesus until he was put through a pagan practice, I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, that just kind of goes along with the theme of them mixing pagan beliefs, pagan practices, pagan rituals, reinterpreting them or retooling them to be Christian in order for the pagans to be easily converted into the faith. That was one of the main goals when they were constructing what we know now as Christianity. They wanted it to be easily accepted by the population. There's actually one very curious discussion that Jesus has where he talks about the need for circumcision. Now, if you really think about it, Jesus was Jewish. He was circumcised, and circumcision would have been very important to him. So there's no way that at the time that Jesus was born, he could have really had that conversation with his Jewish disciples. So I mean that's just one particular instance when you can tell that something's been inserted into it in order to help pagans convert into Christianity.
Isn't that more of a Paul's innovation, if you will? The fact that why Paul's Christianity got so popular is because that was one of the biggest things. He didn't require circumcisions anymore.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, which I mean, when they were having the pagans being converted into Christians, I mean they, they retooled a lot of things, and so yeah. Sorry, I didn't have a better answer for that.
All right, I got another one.
Just one to go off of that. The whole circumcision thing was very. The idea was it was replaced by Jesus. The whole Paul correcting on that was very much central to the gospel. We can talk about that more.
I was going to say, because that was an early practice of Christianity, that you had to be a Jew in order to be a Christian. So it was Paul retooling it. That's what really had to take off. Paul's version of Christianity became very popular, and he writes many times where he says, I have become everything to everyone, because this is what John's saying, they're utilizing a lot of common constructs to popularize that version of Christianity.
Well, not only that, but you can also find portions of historical text where, like, for instance, Justin Martyr complains about some Jewish Christians that are complaining about pagan beliefs being inserted into the faith. Like, for instance, with the divine fatherhood of Jesus, there were a lot of Jewish Christians at the time that had a problem with that because it resembles pagan beliefs so closely. And so through that we know that they were taking pagan beliefs and retooling them and using them in order to convince pagans to transition into them, into Christianity.
That was Justin Martyr's famous quote where he's pleading with the Romans to accept Jesus as they would the sons of Jupiter because of the virgin birth and that whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure.
There's some, I seem to recall some confusion about where Jesus is from. I'm not sure where I got this notion, but the early Christians or the people who put the Bible together thought that Jesus was from Nazareth, but it was Jesus the Nazarene originally. So it was like he was a member of a Jewish sect, and the village or town of Nazareth didn't even exist at the time that he was born.
So he's asking about the myth of Nazareth and whether or not Nazareth existed at Jesus' birth.
You're saying that his culture was of Nazarene.
Kind of the Renaissance argument.
Right. I've looked into that, and from what I can tell, from what I've read, which maybe you guys can provide some better reading for me, but when I started looking into that, I found that a lot of people were saying, well, here's the earliest reference of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't exist at the time. So I think that there might be a good argument there to say that Nazareth, the community or the culture, didn't exist, but I think that that we would need a little bit harder evidence in order to say that for certain. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, there are a number of sources. I know Price is one of those that argues as well that Nazareth didn't exist. There's a couple of others.
Nice.
There's a couple of others. Renaissance one. I've got an archaeologist cited source as well where indicates the same thing, Nazareth not existing at the time of Jesus.
But Renaissance is a good read. His whole work is based around that.
Okay. Well, like I said, the information that I found didn't really provide me with the hard evidence, I guess, to say that it didn't exist. So I would really love to read what you guys got.
Yeah. Caleb.
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot of interesting information. So I thought I would just make note that like a lot of these traditions, like the December 25th thing, and also some of the Old Testament passages interpreted, incorrectly, trying to find, pointers to Jesus. I thought it'd be worth pointing out that a lot of Christians don't buy into that. I'm actually a Christian, in a particular group that I'm a part of. I actually have people I know who don't even celebrate Christmas because they are worried about giving the wrong impression, that kind of thing. But anyway, it's definitely a lot of mistaken associations have been made over the years. So anyway, I thought I would point out that just because some people have said things like that, don't attribute it to all Christians.
Caleb is saying is not all Christians believe the same thing.
Well, right. But what I'm really focusing on here is the is like what people believed in the first century. So I mean, if you have people that are saying that this was prophesied, by the prophets or whatever, in the first century when these gospels were being written, I don't really think that necessarily needs to take into consideration, current people in town. It was written like Mark was written in I want to say 50 AD, and then the subsequent gospels were written after that. So I mean, I think that that the point of my presentation tonight, connecting the Old Testament with the New Testament, is more focused on what people believed in the first century, the first, second, and third and fourth centuries, rather than what people believe now.
Right. Yeah, and that's worth looking at. But things like you pointed out, people didn't even care about the time Jesus was born until 200s or something like that. Yeah, I'm just pointing out things like that.
Well, it was actually heresy to celebrate your birthday until the 300s. I mean, if you look at Origen, he talks about how celebrating your birthday is like being full of sin, like Herod and all these other evil people. So I think what John was pointing out there is the fact that, even celebrating your birthday was deemed as heresy. And the fact that wildly changed in the 4th century, it was kind of crazy. Am I right, John?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because you have the, I believe there's a passage in Jeremiah that actually specifically says, "Do not cut down a tree, bring it into your house, and adorn it with gold and stuff," which is pretty explicitly saying, "Don't have Christmas trees," because that was a pagan tradition. They would bring in evergreens, around that time as like a good luck or whatnot.
Saturnalia.
Yep.
John, thank you so much, man. Thanks for your time. I don't know if you want to plug anything since we are still live and this will be posted.
Yeah, well, I would love everybody to check out my channel. I have a whole list of my Did Jesus Exist series. I have a lot of videos on it where I cover a whole lot more than what I did tonight, including miracles. how the miracles actually relate to the miracles that Elijah and Elisha performed, how they're direct mirror copies of it, and a whole lot more interesting things that I cover on that. Using more than just these books too, I use some of Richard Carrier's on the historicity of Jesus, as well as these two other books. So I would love everybody to check me out there at Godless Engineer here on YouTube. And I would just like to thank the Mrs. Milwaukee team for having me to talk and for allowing me to speak with such a diverse group. And definitely go to the debate in October, debate and conference, because I know I'm going to be there, and I hope that I can see everybody that's in the room right now there.
Yeah, we can't wait to have you in Milwaukee. Awesome job on this, John. I know it's probably took some time. Fantastic information. And you get to meet Price up close, so then you can ask him some more questions based on his book. So I think that'll be fun too.
Oh yeah, no, I can't wait.
Do we have his PowerPoint?
It's good. It's recorded.
Well, I mean,
Thanks, John.
If I don't want to see it in the recording, where can
I
we
don't.
find your PowerPoint outside of the recording?
Yeah.
I can give you a link to the PowerPoint.
Awesome.
Or just email it to us.
Yeah, can you put it on the thread then? We'll figure out a way to put
Yeah, I could put it in the message thread on Mythicist Milwaukee.
Awesome, John. Thank you so much, man.
No, thank you guys.
Have a good night, man.
Nice and concise.
All right, you too.